All right, well look, let's get going. We've only got an hour and it's a big subject. Let me just very quickly introduce the panelists this morning. We've got Vikram Akula, who's one of the kind of lesser known, but when you look at the size of what he's done, superstars of microfinance, and I think we'll be seeing him on panels like this a lot more in the coming years. Helen Clark, who I'm thrilled is with us. She's Administrator of UNDP, an organisation I have very high regard for, and former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Morgan Tsvangirai, who is probably got the hardest Prime Minister's job in the world as Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, and it's great, Morgan, that you could be with us today. Bill Gates, who needs hardly any introduction for all he's done on development issues through the Foundation, an astonishing contribution, thank you. And Michel Kazatchkine, who is the head of the Global Fund, which, as you'll hear, and I think you all know it, is really one of the great success stories of a development initiative, which actually, I think it's right to say, was launched here at the World Economic Forum and shows just the kind of powerful public-private partnerships that can generate new funds for development when you get the political will and government commitment. And Jeff Sachs, a very old friend and colleague of mine who has been a champion of the Millennium Development Goals since we began and has been active not just in forums like this, but on the ground in Africa through the Earth Institute, as you'll be hearing. We're going to start with a very quick round of first questions from me, which is really just asking each panelist in turn to assess the current status of the MDGs. Where are we? It's 2010, there's 5 years to go. What's the scorecard? Vikram.
In terms of the MDGs, clearly there's been some progress, but the data certainly suggests that there's going to be a decline once we get the full results from the previous fiscal year. Clearly the financial crisis has had an impact on the progress that we've made. Now, it's clear that in order to address the financial crisis, we're going to have to radically accelerate our progress towards MDGs, our funding towards MDGs. And in this context, just to sort of move the discussion, it seems to me that we can't simply expect the governments will invariably cut their aid budgets. We're already seeing some of that. And what would be nice to see is some complementary channels to provide funding for MDGs. And here, particularly, I'm talking about private sector approaches, such as my own sector, microfinance, and we can get into more details on that. In terms of the data, the data suggests that East Asia has done better, Sub-Saharan Africa, clearly there's actually more extreme poverty. 50 to 90 million new households are in extreme poverty, according to the data. So there's still a lot of progress that we need to make.
Helen.
Well, at a global level, I think there's been quite a lot of progress on a number of the goals, but of course the recession does set things back somewhat, certainly in particular regions. I think looking forward, it's going to be very much about very focused action country by country on where the bottlenecks are and mobilising the political will and the support around those. But I don't think we should just write off the goals as something that can't be achieved. They can be achieved. They were set to be achieved with the right mixture of leadership, resources and good policies.
Morgan, Zimbabwe's actually seen a retreat. You've fallen further back, I think.
Yes, Chairman. I think that Zimbabwe is a test case of what not to do. In fact, the country has shrunk by over 50% over the last 10 years in terms of GDP. And of course, the consequent impact on the social conditions of the people become even more acute. So even in terms of the MDG, it becomes unrealistic even to set that. I think 5 years to go, we will not even have come out of the trough. So I want to say that there is need for a case-by-case study, a case-by-case focus. Yesterday we were talking about an aid architecture. Should it be looking at humanitarian support, or it should be more than just humanitarian support? And I think that's to focus on the development aid rather than on humanitarian support. Thank you.
Bill, you've put a lot of money into this. Has it paid off?
Absolutely. The incredible thing about the MDGs is that before we had them, the real metric of which country were doing things well, how should the different UN agencies work together, what was the goal, was so unclear. And so the MDGs have been fantastic, whether it's within the aid community, turning to corporations and saying, okay, here's where you have your expertise, therefore how you can contribute, and looking at some countries that are falling behind and saying, okay, what is it they're not doing that these other countries are doing? So the MDGs themselves have been incredible, and we're going to get this report card in 2015. We need to work a lot harder, including putting money in to make our grades better than the current trend line says. It's clear we're not going to get straight A's even if we do that, but among the stories I think are phenomenal. Michel will probably talk about malaria, where if things go well, we'll hit that. We've got countries like Vietnam that are likely to make all the Millennium Development Goals. You have childhood deaths, which was over 12 million a year in the base year 1990, and now last year was under 9 million. And people don't talk, if 100 people are killed in a plane crash, that's a big headline. Here we have millions of children that are living. We have the positive effect that has on actually reducing population growth and the benefits to everything that we care about as you reduce population growth in these areas. Some of the things that have been tough, the maternal mortality was set very ambitious, not much progress on that. Africa as a whole, very tough. But that's great because then we redouble and we look and say, okay, what can we do?
Michel, you lead in one of the areas where I think, as Bill's just said, there's been real success because there's been real political will.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, I think health is the one area of development where we've seen considerable progress. If I look back at 2000, at the time when the MDG goals were set, at that time, in the areas we deal with, basically there was no one on AIDS treatment in the developing world. Today it's 4 million people. It's 40%, over 40% coverage of estimated needs in Africa. Malaria was basically a neglected disease, and today we're seeing decreases by 50 to up to 70 or 80% of malaria-related mortality in small children below 5, and in the number of new malaria cases in at least 10 of the most endemic African countries. And TB, people, we always somehow tend to forget about TB, but we've made considerable progress there as well. The number of what we call, in our jargon, case detection, that is basically the number of people newly detected with TB and then referred to treatment, has actually doubled in the last 4 years. And this afternoon there will be a session run by Gavi that will really discuss the tremendous success we had with child's immunization. But I think for this particular panel, let me just add two things. One is, let us discuss what are the factors behind that progress. You said political will. I would also add resources, societal mobilization, mobilization of the civil society, of the private sectors, all actors coming together, and then a focus on results, setting objectives, and then measuring progress against results. And then the second thing I would say is that the whole thing is very fragile. Prime Minister, you're absolutely right. It takes a lot of time to get there. It takes a very little time to lose all of what we've gained if we do not sustain the effort.
Michel, thank you. Jeff.
I think it's, for me, interesting to reflect on a meeting here 10 years ago where the CEOs of pharma sat in a room. I was together with them. The AIDS pandemic was running completely out of control. And as Michel said, there was not one human being in Africa, with already 25 million infections, not one single person on AIDS treatment because there was no system, there was no financing, there was no strategy, and CEOs were being pummeled for their lack of attention to this, and the patent war and all the rest around this was going on. And it was very hard for them to move because they could do certain things like reducing the prices on the medicines, but they couldn't do delivery. And from this meeting and work with Kofi and work with you and discussions with the industry, we helped get the Global Fund started. And with Bill's leadership and Michel's leadership, and now there are 4 million people on treatment, and a turn of that pandemic is underway. One could say the same about malaria, one could say the same about food production, and many other things. So the lesson of the Millennium Development Goals is that in a world of unbelievable range from wealth to poverty, there are very practical things that can be done to end extreme poverty and to bring disease under control. And the problem is one of designing the systems to do it and getting the private sector and the public sector together for success. And there are a lot of successes that are halfway through and some that need to get even to the halfway mark. But I think this has been a decade that has been very creative in making breakthroughs, but it has not yet finished the job of diffusion of these breakthroughs to those who need it. And that's really the challenge right now.
Well, look, I think that this is a remarkably clear statement of where we are at the moment, some real successes in some areas. The fact that those successes have come not just from aid volume, but from the partnerships, those who've gotten involved, and through just steady, sustained support, and I might add measurement, which is so critical to this. And it leads one to think that whatever the difficulties of aid volume going forward, that around these partnerships, around issues of efficiency and priority setting, we can perhaps replicate some of what we've done in public health in the other areas. And perhaps we'll start at the other end, which means, Jeff, you get another go. What would be the 2 or 3 things you would like to see us all focus on in the next year or so?
Mark, what we've learned, and with a lot of partners here, with working together with UNDP, working together with the Global Fund, working together with Bill and Melinda, the foundation, is that if you go to any very poor area physically, a village, a region, a slum, the practical things that can be done in transformation are profound. Vikram's doing this as well throughout India. And so technology is our friend right now. Systems are our friend, and especially hugely powerful ways to, in site-specific manner, to help lift people out of extreme deprivation, help them get on their way. And what I would say most importantly to any business person who's here by virtue of being in international business and concerned about this, if you got a product that is adding value in the world, you've got a product, a technique, a management system that can add value in the fight against poverty as well. And what we're doing, just to highlight one example, in a project with my colleague here, John MacArthur, in Millennium Villages throughout Africa, covering more than 500,000 people, we're finding that mobilize connectivity with Ericsson, with the local phone providers doing wireless broadband, mobilize the malaria toolkit as we have it now, the bed nets that Sumitomo Chemical produces, the medicines that Novartis and others produce, mobilize the high-yield seeds that Monsanto, the fertilizer of Yara and others. And what you have is a very low-cost package that is completely transformative of the lives of very poor people. And within 3 or 4 years, we're seeing child mortality rates come down by 30, 40%. We're seeing malaria come down by more than 90%. We're seeing communities get on AIDS treatment where previously mothers and fathers were simply dying. We're seeing mother-to-child transmission of malaria come down to very low levels. We're seeing maternal mortality, which is the horrific scourge of very poor countries because there's no emergency room to stop a hemorrhage in childbirth, come down to almost nothing because these are straightforward, practical applications of existing knowledge that, when the poor are availed of them, help to get whole regions out of poverty and then on their way with their own sustainable economy. So the main message I'd like to suggest to any businesses here that are operating in very low-income settings, and a lot of people are sourcing products and a lot of people are trying to sell products or doing microfinance, apply a holistic set of tools, and one can see a transformation of your suppliers and your customers and your market. And you find out that what doesn't seem like a market when you get started, whether it's the mobile phones or the fertilizer purchases or many other things, becomes a very dynamic center for new business as well. So this is a business opportunity, and it's a matter of applying the knowledge that we have in a systemic and systematic and holistic way.
Thanks, Jeff. Michel, I'm going to challenge you to just say, in terms of your next 2 or 3 priorities, not just in the public health area, but what are the lessons of the success in public health for, say, education or agriculture?
Yeah, lessons of success, but also lessons from what I see
Yeah.
being very fragile.
Sure.
I would say partnerships, innovation. Let me start with those 2 first. Partnerships. We talk a lot about partnerships here, and I think partnerships have made tremendous progress at the global level. When it comes to the ground, Jeff, spoke about some of the examples of what can happen on the ground. I still find that there's a lot more that we can do. The UN agencies have been really making a lot of progress in delineating what each of them should do and how they best can work together. Yet at the country level, we do see tremendous differences from country to country. The private sector and the civil society, I think what the Global Fund model has shown is what can be achieved when everyone comes together, when the civil society, the public sector, and the private sector will actually share responsibility and commitment, and share accountability for what we're having. I've seen wonderful examples. Yesterday I was meeting here with the CEO of Standard Bank. This is a bank that is broadly present in many countries in Africa. Standard Bank is providing pro bono services to many of our recipients to help them actually manage the large flows of money that come from the Global Fund. This is a remarkable example of partnership, and Jackie, the CEO, was telling me how rewarding this is for actually the people in the business. So consolidating the partnerships, first priority. The second, innovation. Jeff just talked about innovation, technological innovations, and I'm sure Bill will talk about this, and innovation in systems. But let me talk a bit about innovation in finance. ODA has its limits, and we will see that in the current climate. So what people call innovative finance, which was a sort of option, to me comes now as a necessity. And there are many ways, and I've seen from where I am wonderful examples. Let me just quote United, which, as you know, has a lot of its money coming from a tax on airline tickets, and we're working in close complementarity in the multilateral system between United and the Global Fund. Product Red, which is a very different but wonderful example of branding some products by major companies, and the net profit of the sales from some of those products will actually go and support some of our AIDS grants in Africa. What we call Debt to Health, which is an interesting mechanism, changing debt into actually money for health. So let's say Indonesia, instead of repaying 50 million euros to Germany, would see 25 millions of that erased, provided that the other 25 millions are re-injected by Indonesia into its own health, Global Fund health grant. So there's, and I'm hearing a lot of, new ideas. The red model could actually probably grow into some of the financial system. I believe there's a lot we can gain in innovative finance. And finally, I just spoke about partnerships, innovation. Of course, in times of economic and financial constraints, we have to think about increasing our efficiency at every step in everything we're doing. We were just discussing that briefly with Bill right before this panel. We at the Global Fund see some of the costs of services, to deliver, let's say, TB treatment. Huge differences between one country to another. One of the ways to reduce that is to make everything public. For example, we're now publishing on the web the price at which each drug is purchased by each country. And that is a tremendous instrument for helping the competition and for actually decreasing the prices. And finally, of course, a focus on results and on priorities. And, I'm very conscious that it will be very difficult for us to get more ODA money. I'm also saying, Gavi plus Global Fund, that is maybe 2% of all ODA money. So there's still 98% for the governments to think about where they want to have their priorities for the coming years.
Bill, your thoughts of next steps?
Well, governments are going to be a big element in this. Health aid went from the year 2000 from $5 billion a year to about $20 billion a year. And so we need to keep the pressure on. A lot of commitments have been made. You have 4 or 5 countries, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Netherlands, who've always been fantastic. You've got a few like Spain and the UK who really grew what they were doing and got up very close to that 0.5% goal. So we're going to have to push on that. These needs are even greater. It's the people in these countries who suffer the most. I do think the innovation point's a very good one. Vaccines are this miracle technology. We've got some new ones that we need to get out there. Per life saved, it's only a few $1,000s. So it's incredibly sad if the financial limitations are why those things are not getting out there. It is great to see the broad range of participants. Jeff talked about the corporate sector, whether it's food or banking, IT companies coming in with wireless or software things. We're seeing an increase in that, and we need to see a lot more of it.
Thanks. Mr. Prime Minister.
I think the challenge is a leadership challenge. In Africa, I think that for the past 10 or so years, there's been too much focus on politics and on designing a development model that is relevant on the ground. When I look back in my little village and I make an assessment, what is that is going to make an impact? I see a couple of benchmarks. One, they have no water, they have no electricity. They still live in their little thatched houses. The children are going to school 10 kilometers. Those are the realities of underdevelopment. Now, what is needed is that what development model can pull that village out of that vicious circle of poverty and out of this peasant entrapment. I say that these are things that are taken for granted by other communities, but are very essential in changing the mindset of that village to go to another higher step of development and focus. So to me, one, I think it's leadership. Two, I think that we always design things for people without actually talking to the people about what are their priorities for the upliftment of their own communities. Thank you.
Helen, you've had a chance now, half a year into the job, to think, what are your priorities at UNDP in this?
Well, I just want to pick up on what Morgan said about leadership, because I think leadership is absolutely critical. The comment was made, I think, by Bill Gates that the proportion of government's budget that's ODA-based is, of course, very small. So most of the money for development is going to come out of a country's own resources and budgets. And the critical thing is the leadership, the vision, the strategies, the policies, the capacity to deliver out of that. What can be done with ODA is very important. It can be catalytic, it can certainly be supportive, but it can't be a substitute for smart government at the country level. So I think Morgan's absolutely right to emphasise leadership. But we shouldn't let the developed world off the hook for the commitments that it's made. I know that Canada at this year's G8 meeting is going to make a feature of accountability on the Gleneagles commitments. And one has to say that with respect to the commitment to double ODA for Africa from 2004 to 2010, it is woefully underdelivered, somewhere in the 80 to 90% territory. Now, again, money isn't everything, but it certainly helps, and it will help in a catalytic sense. So let's not let up on pledges that were made. Look, I'm aware that the recession has been very painful in developed countries as well. But developed countries have more resilience. They have deeper pockets. They have the social safety nets. They have ways of coming through it. With so many of the countries with which we work, they don't have that resilience, all those deep pockets. So the recession for them, if it's cutting back on the education budget, may mean a child never gets back to school again. If it's cutting back on the health budget, it may mean a child never getting those essential vaccinations. If it's has an implication for the family budget with more people going into extreme poverty, it may be poor nutrition, which has lifelong health effects. So that's the reality of the recession's impact in the least developed and many low-income countries and low-income communities and emerging economies as well. And that's why I think that the moral case for keeping donors to their commitments is a very compelling one.
Great, thanks. Just on this donorship point of government money, one of the single sort of simplest things but most cut-through things I've heard at this Davos is a YGL proposal, a Young Global Leader proposal, that quite simply government donors be made to say where their pledge is coming from, is it new money, how's it going to come out, and so that it can be tracked and followed, because there is unfortunately a huge distrust developing around these promises, because there is this gap between what is declared put out there in the spotlight to much applause, and then the money doesn't follow. So I think improving this accountability to live up to pledges is a key issue, whatever the economic condition.
Can I add to that? I think it sort of plays then into almost a lot of distrust and cynicism about any promise made for the future, and that plays out in other settings like Copenhagen, where clearly money is going to be needed to make the climate agreement move, but there's distrust as to whether it really will be new money. Will it be predictable? Will it just be a diversion from other funds? It doesn't help trying to get some harmony internationally on these critical issues.
Right. Now, Vikram, I'm going to ask you to speak in two hats, if you like. One is as the head of a kind of new generation of microfinance, which is market-based, is a very successful business, is building a huge number of clients across India, and is an extraordinary model, and you'll talk about how you're using that to deliver development goals on the back of the basic business, which is already enormously helpful to poverty reduction. But you're also a young global leader. And this week, the Young Global Leaders have put out an initiative of how using their companies and their professional backgrounds and personal commitments, how you can combine all that so that every one of us can contribute to meeting the goals. The People's Action Plan, where young global leaders from Facebook are using Facebook as a tool to increase development effectiveness. You're making some pledges. There's some stuff on deworming. I think it's a powerful example of how we can all do something, and you might just say something about that as well as
Sure,
microfinance.
but before I do, I'm too tempted to pick up on some of the themes here, particularly the notion or the discussion of the private sector being involved. And one of the things that I just want to highlight here is we framed it slightly as this is something good for the private sector to do, and I want to reframe that as something that it's essential for the private sector to do, and actually that the stakeholders involved, particularly government policymakers, need to have policies that actually stimulate this so that the corporation is getting involved in this not just because they're getting goodwill or doing it out of goodwill, but because it makes sort of business sense. And the premise for this is something that we've all talked about, which is that the fact is that the funding, whether it's ODA funding or the government's domestic spending, is not commensurate with what is required in terms of really radically accelerating the pace of moving towards MDGs. And unless there is a complementary way in which the funding can be stimulated, I don't think we will actually, get the straight A's that we absolutely need to do in terms of the MDGs. I'm going to give the example of microfinance, since Mark, you had asked about that. So in my company, we provide small loans and small insurance products to 6 million women across India. And I think what's most exciting about that is that this is a purely commercially driven enterprise. It does not require donor funding. It does not require grant funding. Yet it makes a tremendous impact on the lives of the poor. And I would argue that indirectly or directly, it hits probably 6 or maybe 7 out of the 8 MDGs. Now, what's significant about that is then the government has an opportunity to take its spend on MDG and redeploy those into harder to reach areas where the private sector or the commercial models don't exist. And I think that governments that maybe are forced to cut back on their spending or not increase it, as that they've committed, here is a way to stimulate the private sector, call it creative capitalism, if you will, so that the MDGs can be met. And I'll give you, one specific example, again, out of my own work, of how this could be done. Let's take the lack of social safety nets that we see among the poor in many developing countries. It's a tragedy when they fall into crisis. Because of the lack of social safety nets, they fall further into a downward spiral of poverty. Now, the government can, at low cost or even no cost, simply have a policy that facilitates a safe place for poor people to save. Today, they can't go to banks. Banks are too far away. They don't have the literacy. They don't have, the banks don't take them seriously when they bring, 10 rupees, out of, sort of soiled notes. And so you have the situation where the poor have no choice but to have these very inelegant ways of saving, under the mattress, in a rice jar, tied in a sari, so they end up spending it or losing it. And then when that crisis hits, they're in that downward spiral of poverty. Now, the government can spend a lot of money on trying to build a savings infrastructure, or alternately just set up a set of policies that allows microfinance institutions, that incentivizes banks to go out and reach and provide the poor people a safe place to save, or use technologies that exist like mobile banking, to make this happen. And what's happened in many countries, the central banks of the governments are slightly conservative, but here is a policy measure that at low cost or no cost could harness the power of the private sector to provide a safe place to save, something that's critical for meeting the first MDG for sure, and it could be done in a way that actually brings in, a lot more. I think these examples of creative capitalism policies that stimulate this is not just something that's nice to do, but given the economic recession and given the decrease in funding that invariably we're going to see, this is something that's essential. Now, I'm not saying the government abdicate its responsibility and sort of outsource it to the private sector, but this has to be a complementary channel if we have any hope of reaching the MDGs.
Oh, great. Now, look, we're going to open this up to the floor. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourselves, we'll take a batch of questions. I can see hands up in the front here. Lady at the end, gentleman at the end there, sorry. Yep.
I'm a male. My name is Musa, and I'm 17 years old. I'm from Iraq. And of course, I think strengthening the community as well as supplying solutions is a big factor that plays into solving the MDG and completing the MDGs. And my question is, have you considered youth involvement as a way of strengthening the community therefore using it as a utility to get the MDGs.
Thanks. A couple more. Yeah, okay, and then we'll take you as well. Okay, go on.
Hello, everyone. My name is João Brito. I'm a global change maker. I'm 19 years old. I'm from Portugal. My question is a little related because during all this debate, I didn't hear anything about youth. And nowadays, we are facing that governments, it's hard to give more funds to the Millennium Development Objectives with all the financial crisis. And so I'd like to give you a suggestion that is incorporating youth, because youth are now more active than ever and are committed to change. And they are many times willing to work voluntarily, and that's we represent resources that don't need government spending. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Jamil, a British Council Global Changemaker, and I'm 18 from Sri Lanka. I have been working on the MDGs in the past in regard to conducting pediatric health camps for underprivileged communities in Sri Lanka, and then identifying nutritional deficiencies and so on. My question is to Mr. Gates. In regard to your expertise in the arena of corporations and large corporations that are present here at Davos, what are the incentives you can give these large corporations in order to get them on the roll in achieving these Millennium Development Goals with the incorporation of the social community?
Thanks. Lady, just 3 rows back, yeah.
My name is Sheila Patel. I come from Mumbai. The questions I have for the panel is that halfway through the period of the MDGs, the population has come into cities. And the urban theater is where a lot of this is going to happen. And I don't see any investment in understanding the conundrum and the politics of cities that in fact is producing more problems and more poverty. So I'd like some comments on that.
Very good question. There was, yes, lady back.
Morning. Hi, my name is Zainab Selby. I'm with Women for Women International, and I'm a young global leader. I find the composition of the panel quite interesting because there's only one woman, 6 men, and it's a reflective of the MDG challenges, frankly. Women are disproportionately impacted by every single challenge in the MDG present. And yet I am 100% sure that every member of the panel will say, of course we acknowledge women and there's some money for women and all of these things. Women are still at the margin of the discussion. Money-wise, resource-wise, decision-wise, discussion-wise. And I don't know what we can do to change that dynamic, starting with the composition of the panel.
Thank you, Zainab.
Excuse me, sir. Excuse me.
Hi, I'm Carol Edelman, Director of the Center for Global Prosperity. And I would just like to hear your views on remittances, which now exceed development aid 3 times. They're over $300 billion coming into the developing countries, and how they're being used creatively now, not only as direct poverty reduction instruments of going in for food and clothing and shelter, but now securitizing loans so that loans can be made so that countries can improve their credit ratings and get better loans. In addition to diaspora bonds, which are being used by Israel and India, it's a huge resource, and I think it hasn't been discussed, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it for meeting the goals.
Okay, there was one, yes, lady back there.
My name is Ulla Tørnes. I'm Minister for Development Cooperation from Denmark. And I fully agree with the overall view that you gave on the Millennium Development Goals from the panel. But I also fully agree with what was stated on the issue of women. None of you touched upon the Millennium Development Goal number 3. And I strongly believe that we cannot achieve the Millennium Development Goals as such if we are not specifically addressing the Millennium Development Goal number 3. So my question would be, the next, how can I say, status that we're going to make internationally will be the summit meeting in September in New York. And my question would be, what is needed from the international community to make sure that we are focusing on the issue of empowerment of women. It relates to population growth, it relates to education, it relates to a lot of other issues. So one thing is the Millennium Development Goal number 3, and another thing is what is needed from all of us to make sure that what you were saying about microfinance and the private sector, that we are addressing and facing the challenge when it comes to employment of young people. We know that when we look at Africa, there is a need for 10 to 15 million new jobs a year just to cover the young people that are getting part of the labor force. So these two issues I would ask you to address. What do we need to change to make sure that we focus on women and that we focus on what I would call private sector-led growth and youth employment? Thank you.
Great, thanks. Two up front in the first and second row here. Whichever of you wants to go first.
Thank you, Mark. President Obama said...
Jamie, identify yourself.
Jamie Drummond of One, a global advocacy organization. President Obama last September said he would approach the summit in September 2010 with a new global plan to realize the Millennium Development Goals and then go on to end extreme poverty in our time. Amazing words which either many people didn't hear or have forgotten were said, and obviously he's got a lot on his plate at the moment. So do many of the people who should be leading on the Millennium Goals. What specifically needs to be done to take the best advantage of the opportunity of the Millennium Goal Summit in September?
Great, thanks.
Thanks. Jamie actually stole my question as well. Thanks, Jamie. Jo Cox, the director of the Maternal Mortality Campaign and a young global leader as well. I was actually going to also just ask, what does success look like in September at the UN summit? And actually, is that the most important forum this year? Or actually, should we just all be focusing much more on local level progress and national level leadership? And secondly, one of the issues that we talked at length about last night is around funding mechanisms for maternal health, maternal and newborn health. Of which Jeff is a powerful advocate. And it would be interesting to just hear your reflections on whether this is the year when we do need a new funding mechanism, particularly focused on maternal and child health, and in fact all of the health MDGs, expanding perhaps the mandate of the Global Fund.
Great, well that was a fantastic round of questions which shows just how much we haven't covered up here. So let's, if everybody can answer as quickly as they can, hopefully we can come back and have a few more from the floor. But let's start, Jeff, at your end. Don't answer everything. Just pick up what you feel you can address best.
A couple of things very quickly. First, the lack of financing has nothing to do with this recession. It has to do with a long-standing neglect. I've been at this for 30 years. Believe me, this has no business cycle component whatsoever. I'm not going to elaborate on it. This is also not heavy lifting for the world. We're talking about something under 1% of the income of the wealthy countries. This is a deep-seated psychological and political problem. It has nothing to do with our recession. I just want to be clear about that. In terms of women's empowerment, first I'd be very happy to give my seat up to any woman who would like to come up here and represent this. I can't account for my gender. I was born that way. But let me say, in terms of substantive things to do, the biggest missing element in the international system is support for secondary education, especially for girls. The MDGs are flawed because they focus only on primary education. The most decisive part of the life cycle of a woman is adolescence and young womanhood and being able to stay in school. And so if you want to make a difference, Denmark, which wonderful donor, start funding for secondary education for women. It's missing completely from the international system, and it should be definitely added. Secondly, the reason, the most lagging of all of the Millennium Development Goals by far is MDG 5, which is safe childbirth. And this is because there's no funding mechanism for it. And again, this is straightforward systems. You can bring down the roughly 500,000 deaths in childbirth down to very low levels very quickly through known standardized procedures for safe childbirth. We ought to have a window in this gentleman's fund that funds that effort. It's not hard to do. It's not expensive. Mothers die because we don't finance the basic, the misoprostol or the other anti-hemorrhaging or a C-section or other very basic things that have brought down maternal deaths almost to nothing in the rich world. So this is a matter of basic organization and basic financing. And wherever you see a financing window, like AIDS, TB, and malaria, you see much progress. Wherever that doesn't exist, you see huge lag. It's pretty mechanical. And so I think that in terms of finally the plan, there are some completely evident gaps right now. The G8 announced last summer $20 billion over 3 years for smallholder agriculture. Not a penny has shown up yet because of organization, because it's easy to make a statement. It's not so easy to follow through. That's why I like the business community. It understands bottom lines. It understands timelines. It understands milestones. At least you people get things done. Government, I'm not so sure.
Okay. Michel.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'll pick up on three things. And the first is actually, I'd like to follow Vikram, because you were asking us about what do we see important for the near future, and I think more efforts in building safety nets, social protection, health insurance. That is not only a way to avoid tens of millions of people of falling below the threshold of poverty because of out-of-pocket expenses for health, it's also a key element to sustainability of all of efforts. And I think we haven't been talking enough, perhaps, so far around the sustainability of our efforts. The second, of course, is to say a few things about the question on the community strengthening. This is a very important component. People may know in this audience that 40%, of the money that the Global Fund invests in countries, that's 40% of 19 billion now committed, is going to the civil society. And a large portion of that is going into a window that we call community strengthening, because there's no way things will be achieved and the progress we want to see will be achieved without full involvement of all sectors and particularly of the civil society and of the communities. The communities are key to deliver care, to implement the services for peer education, for prevention. And we've been learning that from the experience of the last few years of implementing our programs. So thank you for actually raising this issue of community strengthening. And finally, thank you to all of you who spoke for women. I would follow Jeff in saying that's the way it is, and here we are on the panel. But there are a number of you, Joe and others, really conducting huge advocacy and efforts to correct the imbalance that we're currently seeing in some of our efforts. I said earlier that I believe we will be close to reaching, or even exceeding some of the health-related MDGs. Let's come again, malaria. But there is one MDG where we're struggling, it's MDG 5. And we can fix it. We can fix it, but we do have to identify a channel of funding that would be focused on results and just do it, because we know what we need to do and how we should do it.
Thanks. We need to pick up the pace a little bit here. Bill.
Well, in corporations, there are some great success stories where companies have been involved, whether it's in the pharma sector, people like GSK, or the food sector like Coca-Cola. We are telling those success stories draws more people in. Within an industry, we're getting third parties to go out and rank the large companies in that industry. And so in the pharma industry, there's a ranking called Access to Medicine. Got some visibility, it needs more. But the right thing happened, that is the companies on the top want to keep doing what they're doing. The companies down low called up and said, okay, what can we be doing more of? So activating that piece, I think there's positive results. In terms of women, I run the foundation in equal partnership with my wife, Melinda. She was just with Michel in Africa and focused in particular on the maternal and childhood health issues. And we do need to get more focused on this. It's of childhood deaths, it's an increasing portion. And it turns out that by integrating prenatal care, breastfeeding, vaccination, good birth care attendance, you can take care of many of the MDGs. You can bring population growth down, you can improve health, and so these integrated approaches that aren't too expensive, there's some good models for those, and that's going to be a huge emphasis. And I do think we'll get some donor funding focused on this, although not nearly enough. I'll stick with Jeff on money it's criminal, there's not more money.
Morgan, perhaps you could certainly say something on women and youth, both of whom have been critical in the struggle in Zimbabwe.
Chairman, I think the issues raised by the audience are very, very relevant. There's so many with the time we're given, I think it will be very limited. The first thing I want to draw attention to the audience is the absorptive capacity. And I agree with Jeff that it's not the absence of money. Sometimes the absence of absorptive capacity. If, for instance, a country is given $1 billion, will they be able to absorb it and make sure that it's effective on the ground? So I think the challenge is also building that absorptive capacity of whatever assistance is given. The second issue is the youth involvement. My experience, and I think it's prevalent, I think in Africa, 55% of the population is below the age of 15. And in my country, as you go to 18, they've all finished O levels. Highly educated, but the quality of education is not relevant for those youths to be able to be anything meaningful in their lives. So we need to change the curricula in order to suit the challenges of the youth. It also means that the future lies actually in the youth. If we don't do something about that, we create problems of rural-urban migration, and all those problems are ascended with it. The issue of women, I think the challenge is to move from those inhibitions, those cultural blockages, and the only way to move towards that is to educate the women. I have seen a great advancement of advocacy of women to demand parity on all activities because women are empowered through education and through other means. So I think it's not a wish, it's a process. We hope that the issue of advocacy for parity in positions may help to encourage women to come up the ladder and to be able to take up their rightful place without necessarily being patronized.
Thank you. Helen, one thing that the campaigners in the room want an answer on is should they be using the UN General Assembly of 2010 as a kind of organizing, lobbying point for getting the MDGs, advanced this year?
Yes, and a lot of the other conferences and events along the way as well, and many are planned. there was a question, do we focus on the global level or just get back down to country action? Look, it's both. They're complementary. I think the global level, it's about advocacy, it's about lifting awareness. And bear in mind that very few of the leaders who came in 2000 and signed up to the Millennium Development Goals are going to be going as leaders this year. There's a whole new generation of leaders really to re-energise and inspire around the MDGs. But that the action needs to be very, very country-focused on the particular blockages which are preventing progress on the MDGs. A sentence on some of the other very important points made. Those who raise the issue of women are 1,000% right. The reason we are lagging on a number of MDGs is because the status and priority given to the needs of women in too many countries is far too low. That's why maternal health lags. It's why the empowerment of women goal lags. It's why the equal access to education lags. And I think it's absolutely critical that this year there is a focus on gender analysis and perspectives into those MDGs. If we can't lift the status of women, the respect for women, elevate the priority given to the needs of women, we can't shift the MDGs. I think it's absolutely critical. To the young people who raise the issues, it's a truism to say the world has its largest ever generation of young people. It is a huge generation. It's a generation full of hope. But there's a shortage of jobs for that generation. There's a shortage of education opportunities, healthcare, their sexual and reproductive health rights need attention. So we should be very focused on delivering to the young people of the world. Remittances. UNDP last year put out the Human Development Report on migration. We need orderly ways for people to migrate because of the importance of remittances, both from seasonal workers and from those who are able to get permanent status in countries. Last point on President Obama and the inspirational statement which was referred to. US administration has said they are planning to double their ODA by 2015. Their ODA as a proportion of gross national income is rather low, but the economy is so large that if you double that, it can have a phenomenal impact for the better. So all power to that pledge and it being honoured. And very last point on absorptive capacity, which Morgan raised. UNDP has followed through on the Glen Eagles commitments and produced with the IMF, World Bank, African Development Bank, specific scenarios on what would the absorptive capacity be country by country if the Glen Eagles money could be scaled up. And each of these scenarios shows how it can be done without causing macroeconomic imbalances and so on. So there is a plan and a pathway there if we can get the money to implement the scenarios.
You've got the disadvantage of being last and we're running out of time. Make sure you say a word about remittances and about one word on anything else as well.
Okay, so real quick, women, the point on women is absolutely well taken. This is a failure, this panel, of not having women represented. Having said that, I do, from my microfinance work, have 6.5 million women who inform me every day about the issues that are important to them. Now, that's not an excuse for this panel, but it is to say that there is a understanding and acceptance that women have to be at the center if we're going to meet the MDGs. It's been articulated, at least it's in practice in many of the villages. We need to do much more at this level. The minister from Denmark raised an important question about employment, but let me suggest that it's not just about creating employment, but how you create employment. If I can critique my own country, India, they have a massive $20 billion program on employment generation that's guaranteed. But the question is, why should the state be guaranteeing and providing employment? Why couldn't that $20 billion be given differently so that either self-employment or other forms of employment that's happened that is perhaps more vibrant than the state actually delivering it? In terms of involvement of youth, yes, I encourage that. I'm going to broaden that discussion slightly and say involvement of the beneficiaries, so-called, who are at the end of MDGs. We cannot be doing for, we need to take their inputs. This is where market-based solutions fit in very well. If you give vouchers to go to school, the teachers will show up because the children or their mothers will send them to different places if the teachers don't. That's a more powerful way of doing this than, again, having government schools. Again, I've taken my example of my own country in India, where 2 out of 4 teachers don't show up, and the 1 out of 2 who do, at any given moment, only one of them is teaching a market-based solution in some ways puts the power back into the hands of the so-called beneficiaries. Remittances, I'm wrapping up. I'll just make the broader point on remittances. Technology for access to finance for the poor. This is what's going to help those remittances actually work out quite well. I'll close, but I will be remiss if I don't say that the Young Global Leaders has a task force on the MDGs. They've made significant pledges, including deworming and others, and there's a lot of vibrant activity going on there. So I'm part of that group and want to acknowledge that.
All right, so look, thank you to the panel. What we've seen is first a puncturing of the myth that somehow the MDGs are this beleaguered set of empty commitments against which there's been no progress. This has been an astonishing decade of development success, and I think that's the biggest single message here. But the second message is it's highly fragile, it's uneven across sectors, it's uneven across countries, and Zimbabwe speaks to a country with historically great capacity, middle income status, which like a number of other countries because of political difficulties has fallen back during these years. And I think we've also heard this morning that this is government money and government will, but it's that supplemented and partnered by private sector collaboration, civil society advocacy, and civil society solutions at the local level. And that in that sense, it's not time to sort of sit back and say, well, thank goodness the MDGs did a bit better than we thought. It's to go into these last 5 years of this present MDG 15-year period determined to come across the finishing line with as much success as possible across as many of the goals as possible in as many countries as possible. Thank you.